What this is all about is love, learning to love, and the pursuit of knowledge. I think that this thing we're in is a theater. Time is the movies of eternity. The moving pictures of eternity.
Dr. Moody, it is such an honor to speak with you today. I'm so excited. I'm calling you from Germany. You are currently in America. Where exactly are you at the moment?
I'm in Sarasota, Florida.
That's excellent. You probably have beautiful weather today.
We absolutely do. I just took my walk a while ago. I'm so happy that it's warm out there.
So excited to have you. Let me just briefly start by introducing you because we'll have a German audience as well. They obviously know you really well, but let me briefly say that for decades, your work has profoundly shaped the way we understand near-death experiences. You even coined the term, and that's important because that way you gave language to many, many people around the world who had struggled to talk about what they had experienced, and they suddenly felt part of a larger community, which is so valuable. So you opened not just a field of research, but an ongoing conversation about death, consciousness, and what it means to be human. And before we dive in, let me briefly say I'm a theoretical physicist. Much of my work is around questions of consciousness as well, reality, but also the deeper ontological structure of the universe. So I'm also really interested in exploring the deeper, larger existential questions with you today. So at some point we'll go all in. But before we do that, let me very briefly, start asking you, you have written a new book. Perhaps we can talk about that too. First, however, I'd like to ask you, how did it all begin? How did you first come across the topic of near-death experiences?
When I first became known for studying near-death experiences was about 1970.
Yes.
And I was a professor of philosophy at East Carolina University. I had actually found out about the phenomenon in 1962 by reading Plato. But then in 1965, I met an actual person, a living person, Dr. George Ritchie, who had such an experience. So I got my PhD in philosophy in 1969 and began teaching philosophy. And quickly realized when I taught Plato's my favorite philosopher, that the students were very interested in this question of an afterlife, which Plato is. So very quickly I began to hear these reports of students and then faculty members who talked to me about, I almost died and I went up above my body and so on. And so I went to medical school in 1972. And that was the entree to my subject. Now, when about 1970 was the year that I first became known, people started to ask me to these civic clubs to lecture and so on. I just didn't know what to make of it. I was a professor of logic and Greek philosophy, right? So about 1970, people started asking me, Dr. Moody, can we have proof of life after death? And my mind immediately went to Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead and Wittgenstein and Frege and, the Principia Mathematica. I mean, that was my level of thinking about proof.
Sure.
So I remember thinking, no, I don't think so. Now, over those intervening years, when I went to medical school, I was gradually, and then forensic psychiatry and a lot of careers. And also a career as a comedian for a while, which I greatly enjoyed. But throughout that, I gradually kind of realized that people don't really mean what they say when they say proof of life after death. Like most people, what they mean is, Dr. Moody, it is a rational thing to anticipate and expect that when I die, I will have a continued consciousness as a self. And what I say to them is now I say, yes, because what they really are asking is there just some kind of am I being irrational is really what they're asking by anticipating it. And I say no.
Yeah.
And no, most people are not interested in it beyond that. But for those who are, then they immediately come up against the wall of David Hume, who said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And that is the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
Because, as later philosophers elaborated, like A.J. Ayer in the logical empiricism movement of the early 20th century, they pointed out that, when we say life after death, it may bring feelings and images to our mind.
Yes.
Right. And we may say, yeah. And so we may mistake that for a meaning. But in terms of the cognitive content of the notion of an afterlife, it's nil. As A.J. Ayer famously said, he said, it makes sense in our language to say that a man survived a total change of personality or a total loss of memory.
Yeah.
But it's a self-contradiction to say that a man survived the annihilation of his body. And that is the reality, no matter how much our romance system wants to say otherwise. And it doesn't discourage me a bit, because I think David Hume's problem and A.J. Ayer's problem are, number one, very real, but number two, not at all insoluble.
Yeah, okay.
And I think that when it boils down to it, it's like the sentence, there is a life after death, is unintelligible, even though it may bring images to our mind. But, go back in your mind to the year 1950 and be a very highly educated and informed person of the year 1950. And now listen to the following sentence. All four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. That's nonsense in 1950.
Yeah.
Now add the knowledge of DNA and its role in heredity and gene editing, gene cloning, and gene splicing. You got a scenario
Right.
of intelligence.
Right.
And I think where we are right now is we are in that zone. That it's called transpicuence, the state of consciousness when you're going from unintelligibility to intelligibility is where I think we are right now. By the way, I don't know if you might be interested in this story about A.J. Ayer, but when I was in 1964, I read Language, Truth, and Logic, where he talks about the afterlife, right? And so then flash forward to 20 years later to the early 80s sometimes. And I was in London for a lecture, and they asked me to go on the BBC. And it was like one of those middle of the night shows, right? So I went to the radio studio, and I went in the green room, and there was A.J. Ayer.
Oh, how fun.
A few years before, I'd read in the newspaper that he had a near-death experience.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they were discussing that. And then I read several articles, and the last article I read, it was very vague, but it made me think that maybe he was kind of thinking, well, no, there wasn't much to it, that he had backed off or something. But there I was, and so with that in my head, that's what I thought. So I talked to him, and I said, so do you think it was a delirium? And he said that, oh, no.
Yeah.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And he insisted not only that it was real, but it was hyper real.
Yeah.
And a very interesting thing he said was that he said they. He never put any reference to they, he said they had prepared it for me. I was interested in time at the concept of time at that point, and he said they set this situation up so I would learn about time, but he didn't elaborate. But anyway, consciousness, that's the story. And where I think that the consciousness problem here is this. To me, one of the most striking aspects of consciousness is that it is narrative in nature.
Correct.
Right? It's like my mind puts the story together. It's like, what else?
Yeah.
And and when some new thing happens to me, there's an automatic process of weaving it into my continuing life story. And that is why I think, I may be wrong, but in David Hume's essay, he said something like, he said, I think the only kind of afterlife that a philosophical person would entertain would be reincarnation. I remember reading Jung, essay Jung did, and it was in the context of Freud's view that the notion of an afterlife is wish fulfillment, right? But he didn't mention Freud in the essay, but it was plain that was the context in which he was thinking. And he said, when I reach a certain age, I just find ideas of the afterlife arising in me. And it's a natural process. Plato points that out at the very beginning of the Republic. Right? Kemphelos says, I've been very successful in life, very busy, and now I get this age, and now I'm thinking about all these stories I heard about the afterlife. I heard that dozens of times.
Yeah.
Just to get to the essence of what I think is that I think that we're not going to solve the afterlife question with the mind we have and with the logic we have. And therefore it makes it seem impossible. You know, when you just review in your mind Hume's statement, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. That seems pretty patently obvious. And then he goes on to say, some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And that is the reality, even though most people think that's impossible.
You know what? Let me throw some small fact from physics in. Many people have thought that it was impossible to think about where does the universe come from, or is there something outside of the universe? And in fact, when I studied string theory and quantum field theory, there are answers emerging. Now, we're not saying in physics that this is reality or that we have proven anything, but we are developing a language to talk about it and to get further, to push the boundaries further. And somehow I think that you and the research about near-death experiences have actually done that. I think you've actually circumvented Hume's argument because you have made people heard, and there are facts and data from these people that somehow bring us further, though we may not have the actual capacity to grasp what is on the other side if there's another side.
That's right. What I think is that since people who have a near-death experience say there are no words for it, it's ineffable, right? And also that it did not occur in the time and space continuum that you and I are in, right? And so, in a way, I think that the near-death experience is posing us some questions. And so let's prepare our minds to answer it. And then go back over there with that knowledge and facts, for example. The difficulty is that when a sentence is unintelligible, we can't put it into the logical system, right?
Yes.
Because it's according to the way of thinking we have about unintelligibility, that once it's unintelligible, we can't go any further. Well, I say that I could show you very quickly, or let you see for yourself that that's not correct, that unintelligibility is not the end, that in fact, unintelligibility itself is an intelligible phenomenon.
Yes.
When the word nonsense comes into mind, we think chaos, unknowable, unfathomable, formless, normless, right? And so that would imply that there are not different types of nonsense, But now listen to this. 'Twas brilliant and the slithy toasted Darren Gimble and the wave. That's nonsense.
Yes.
But now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's nonsense, but it's different.
Yes.
And listen to this. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this city. That's nonsense too, but yet different.
Mm-hmm.
Or Aunt Thoroughly the if will zoom, how's that? That's nonsense too, but yet different. Or now that's different too. Now what I can show is that all of those different types of nonsense have the same structural pattern in common, which is that they abide by some of the rules of language, but they disregard other rules of language so that the outcome is unintelligible. And so each type of nonsense has its own distinct pattern of rule breaking and rule follow.
Well, don't forget where you want to go. I just want to quickly add something. When I talk with people about infinity, some people will say there is just one infinity. But in fact, in math and theoretical physics, it's not true. And it's very similar to what you just said. There are very different types of infinity. There are smaller ones and bigger ones. And they even have name. You know, there are like largenesses of infinities. If you think about, for example, a one-dimensional line without beginning and end, it's a different type of infinity than like a two-dimensional or three-dimensional object. And you can do the same with numbers, like the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They go to infinity, but it's a different type of infinity. And one can show that than the one that includes all of the comma numbers as well. You know, this is very like in a easy. So here we have a similar phenomenon to just what you said with the nonsense. Here we have a phenomenon that we believed we could never grasp as humans. Something infinite is something that's not used to our soul, but we can not only grasp it, we can even see that there are different types and that they structurally still are related to one another.
That's right. Now, when another wrinkle in this is that once you have the idea of nonsense established, you can take any format of ordinary language and you can lay a layer of nonsense down over the top of it.
Okay.
So that when you speak that, it gives the same effect as the meaningful language of that format.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Okay. Mm-hmm.
What people say when they have a near-death experience is, I can't describe it to you. There are no words. And it was not in time and not in space. But the only way I can say it is I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into a light, and I came back to my body and returned to life. That's a travel narrative. But travel narratives make no sense if there's no time and space. Now they say that it's impossible to prove life after death is often what people say. But now I say, let's listen here. Let's think of two things that were regarded as unknowable in the past, which are now common knowledge. Number one, I don't know if you know about Luke Howard. He was, you know, in the early 19th century, science was not as now. It was small groups of hobbyists who had the money to do experiments, who would get together in small groups and discuss.
Yes.
And Luke Howard was a member of the Askesian Society in London. And they pursued scientific subjects and presented papers. And at that time, clouds were the epitome of the unknowable, the unintelligible, the changeless, the changing, the formless, the normless, and so on. And it was just as simple. By the symbolic meaning alone was that clouds were unknowable.
Yeah.
Right? But, and this had been for thousands of years. But Luke Howard, looking out of the carriage during the day on his business trip, said, oh my God, there's different types also. There's the cumulus, the big puffy ones, and there's the cirrus, the feather-like ones, the stratus, and the nimbus. And so he wrote that paper, and it created an instant sensation because anybody who just cared to look out and to go outside for themselves could see it for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, another thing that was regarded as unknowable by, as the epitome of the unknowability was the distance to the fixed stars.
Yes.
Okay, there's no way to measure that, right? But then, by 1838, as I recall, the year the measurement became accurate enough, and I think the first one was 61 Cygni, as I recall, where they realized that it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. If you measure the angle here and wait exactly 6 months, there'll be a difference. And that's parallax.
Yes.
And so what I have done is in effect, I've opened parallax on the afterlife.
Oh, that's a wonderful phrasing, Dr. Moody. Let me just add that there are so many more phenomena that come to my mind, which are exactly the way that you describe it. One more I want to add is people have discussed for so long with Democritus and many of the philosophers whether matter was made up of atoms or what it was made up. And they believed that this would stay a philosophical question, something that you could choose by your liking, but that we could never find out. Well, we obviously have found many ways to look much, much deeper at matter. So yes, what is considered a boundary is very relative to time. So, but I didn't want to interrupt you, Dr. Moody. You've been talking a lot about logic, about language, about the difficulty to talk about something that is not in our logic. But I really want to go a bit more into existentialist questions with you now. So what would you, after all your many, many years of study, what would you say? What do you believe what the structure of reality is? I mean, do you think there is another side? Do you think there is reincarnation? Go ahead and talk a bit about it. You must have some thoughts on this.
Okay, cool. All right, great. Well, this may come as a shock to you. But number one, I love astronomy. With my first subject was astronomy, right? And I love physics. I love science. I love science. And at the same time, I have never been able to be a physicalist. I mean, even when it occurred, when I was a kid, I realized, that cup seems to be on the desk now, and I take a walk and it seems to be on. But that doesn't imply to me that therefore there's some continuing. I can't make that inference. It just does not follow. But I know for most people it's just automatic. They can't help making it. But I've never been able to make it.
So would you yourself then say that you are an idealist? Is that your philosophy?
Well, as long as we can use the Berkeleyan sense.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the, people here say they're idealistic if they have all these, everything is hung out.
No. I don't mean that, no.
I would say I am an ideal.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Let me explain my process. I am a skeptic. Even before I studied Piro in college, I had fallen into that method myself. And it's not what people say, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. That statement is an outright self-contradiction. What skeptic means is to vigorously pursue your inquiry and answer every question. And then the definition is to refrain from drawing a conclusion. So, if you say, I am a skeptic about near-death experiences, I think that it's just a chemistry of the brain. What you're saying is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusions, it's just crazy. And those people are very shallow in their thought process, in my point. But I am a skeptic.
That also fits really well with what Albert Einstein taught me in early years, namely, keep questioning everything, right? And that's something that I do too. But that said, I still do as a physicist, at least that's my soul. I always want to find a system which I can work with. So what I seem to hear from you is that you are an idealist, which I would try to frame as you believe that maybe consciousness is fundamental. Is that what you would say?
Yeah. And the nature of it is important too. For example, when I was doing my psychiatry residency, I had already gotten a PhD in philosophy and been a philosophy professor, and I was well known for my book, And so there, I was the oldest resident. So therefore, in a small town, they need a place where the chief of police and the local celebrities can sneak in the back door of the mental health clinic. Right? I mean,
Beautiful.
and so for a year, I was the one who did the geriatric clinic for the distinguished elderly in town. And there were a lot of international celebrities in that town. So I met a lot of very distinguished elderly people during this year. And repeatedly, I heard the words, Raymond, the older I get, the more when I look back at my life, I develop this uncanny feeling that it's been like then fill in the blank, movie, script, play, novel, story. In other words, they focus on the narrative structure of life. And this, I heard that repeatedly. What I have come to in my skeptical inquiry with my not only refusal to draw a conclusion, but my understanding why that in 2026 it is not yet possible to draw a conclusion that there's an afterlife. What I would say, where I am so right now with my skeptical, I just give up. I have always been able to think my way out of things, but I just can't think my way. It never has that notion of the oxygen deprivation to the brain appeal to me because my very own psychiatry professor in 1972 or 73 told me that when she was resuscitating her own mother unsuccessfully, that she herself got out of her body, saw this tunnel, saw this light. And I've talked to there's lots of people who did not have a near-death experience in the context of having themselves a cardiac arrest or illness or injury, but rather were there at the scene where somebody else, typically somebody else, well known to them, died and were able to have these things where they say that as grandma died, I lifted out of my body, I went part way toward her with this light, I saw her roses. Or people say the room fills with light or changes geometry, or they see the apparitions of the dying person, deceased relatives come into the room. Or in many cases I have where the bystander empathically co-lives the dying life review of the person standing by. Very touching story of a woman. For a long time, I assumed it had to be somebody intimate with the person, right? Because I found that participating in somebody else's life review, the idea has been shocking to me. I'm trying to get myself recused from my own life review. I mean, how embarrassing is what I mean.
Yeah.
But people say, yeah, but yeah, and so I just assumed for years that it had to be somebody. Then some years ago, my wife and I got a communication from an emergency room doctor who was called to the emergency room to resuscitate a patient that he had never laid eyes on. And as this man was dying, the doctor said this guy's entire life came up in a holographic camera. So I get off. I just don't. I know that it doesn't make any sense to say that there is life after death, but I don't know what else to say because I'm a skeptic. Now, let me say one other thing about Pyrrho. Pyrrho was one of the philosophers that went to India with Alexander the Great. And when he was over there, he consorted with the early Buddhists. And so when Pyrrho came back to Greece, he practiced Buddhism. He perambulated, which is walking around the scenery mindfully, and he meditated. So I think that the people who, pride themselves in being scientific skeptics would be rather taken aback to realize that the founder of the skeptical movement was kind of a practicing Buddhism in many ways.
Now, listening to you, I think maybe you don't give up, but maybe you keep going Because hasn't it been exactly what you've been doing all your life? To not draw a conclusion, but to keep going. Isn't that exactly what you've always done?
That's really, I'm give up. I'm baffled. And also, there's another aspect of this, too. The afterlife is coming here. Think about it. When you were about 3 years old, as I gather, I'm watching my own very bright daughter. And at the age of 3 years old, she understood the concept of truth because I said that she thought that I was just making something up, and she said, "You're not telling me the truth." So, by the way, you might, being German, you I think will be very interested in this. My daughter is a Native American Blackfeet Indian from Montana. We adopted her at birth.
Oh, super.
Really, I know that in Germany, people are very often interested in knowing Indian. And she's just a delight. And but anyway, so we understand the notion of truth by the time we're 3. Okay, now, if you go back to ancient Greece in, let's say, 600 BCE, there is no such thing as a notion of truth. And this is why. Truth is that which is the case independently of what anybody perceives, thinks, or believes about it. Right? Now, in a pre-literate culture, it's not possible for people to conceptualize that. And the reason is that the first inkling that we will have of that notion is in connection with what you and I call deduction.
Okay.
Because if Andy is taller than Bill, and Bill is taller than Charlie, then therefore Andy is taller than Charlie. It doesn't matter what anybody thinks. But in the ancient Greek context, the only thing that was independent of human mentation like that was the immortal.
Okay.
Now, think of the gap of that. The person who solved that was Parmenides. And he was apparently affiliated with one of these oracles of the dead or similar institutions. He was on the pedestal of the statuary of him in Iliad. It says, Iantro Mantis, which means prophet. And he indicates in his work about this that he had been along this route many times before, but basically he was abducted by a goddess who abducted him into the underworld in a magical vehicle.
Okay.
And she sang him a song. And that song is the very first written out logical deduction.
Wow.
So she said, Parmenides, when you go back to Earth, don't tell people to believe this because God is this. Tell them to work it out in their own mind and see it for themselves. And when they did, this was still, literacy was there, yes, but it was mostly like a musical score, right? The few people who could read would stand in front of the crowd who could, right? And so that's where still we are. But then Parmenides insisted that his students recite this song over and over and over till they learned it by heart. And when they did, they would grasp the necessary relationship of the premises to the conclusion. And that's the notion of truth. And so people laughed at it. But anyway, so the basic notion of logic, according to its author, came here from the other side.
Oh, that's a fascinating thought. Yeah, okay.
But anyway, it took another 100 years or so for Plato thinking about this. Just a minute here. By the same token, we know that there's some sentences are the case, no matter what anybody perceives, thinks, and believes. By the same token, he said there are other sentences that are not the case, no matter what anybody thinks, perceives, or believes. So that was the concept of falsehood. And he set up the true false disease, and therefore defined the relationship between the literal and the figurative. And my point is these things are, they came out through a long series of events, and not everything went right. because of a lapse between Plato and Aristotle, we can't think very logically about the unintelligible, but we can fill that in. And so once we can fill that in, then when we subsequently have a near-death experience, we'll be able to talk about it in a whole new way. Meanwhile, the afterlife is coming here. Let me explain.
Yes.
Back in your mind, you're probably not old enough to remember 1950s.
No, thank you. That's correct.
Near-death experiences occurred, but they were extraordinarily rare. Being just extremely rare. So the odds that any one person would know about such a thing was nil. Then in the 60s, with the advent of CPR, and in a very quick time, these machines started appearing in department stores. So by the time the heroic Raymond Moody got to there, there were lots of people, right? It was just that I didn't do anything magic. It was just that I had known about this from Plato. And when I began to hear about it, and then I put two and two together, and I quickly gathered all these cases. But what happened was a phenomenon that was extremely rare in 1950 became increasingly common in about 1970 onward.
What I like about that, Dr. Moody, is that when you started researching it, it was not yet an internet community that had the possibility to maybe exchange thoughts and ideas, and there was no opera show yet. It was not a mass hysteria of people, but rather it was individual cases still, though the numbers were increasing. So you had the wonderful opportunity to talk to individuals who had not yet interconnected and made up their stories together, but still they were so similar. That's something that fascinated me so much as a physicist.
Yeah, it is true. And then you ask, what's the basis of the similarities? But I just, I cannot think my way out of the idea that when you die, there's another realm of reality. Let me tell about something that happened to me before I was born. I was born in Porterdale, Georgia, and my mother and father are from Porterdale, Georgia. And I was born in 1944 in Porterdale, Georgia. And Dr. George Ritchie, the first living person I heard a near-death experience from, was from Richmond, Virginia. And I met Dr. Ritchie in 1965 when he was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, and I heard him tell his story, which took place at Camp Barkley, Texas in December 1943, when he was a recruit in the Army doing his basic training. And George's experience was the first one I heard. It got me interested in this phenomenon, and that's how it all began. In 1975, I published my book on near-death experiences. And that was the only contact I had with George in all that time. Was I called him and asked him if I could dedicate my book to him. All right, now, I finished medical school 2 months later in January of 1976. And I was studying medicine in Georgia, so I decided I wanted to go back to Charlottesville, Virginia to do my psychiatry residence. So I flew up there in March of 1976 to interview for my residency. And while I was there, I called Dr. Rich and he said, "Oh, come on over for dinner." So we made that contact. The next day I flew back to Macon, Georgia, where my parents lived, and they were taking care of my kids. And I casually mentioned to my father that the day before I'd been with this Dr. Ritchie, who was the first person I heard this from. By then, my father had heard a tape of George Ritchie's experience, and my father said the following words, George Ritchie, Camp Barkley, Texas, December 1943. That's very interesting. I was there, and so were you. My mom and dad had moved to Camp Barkley in early September. 1943, so my dad could go to officers' candidate school. I was conceived in late September. Georgia's experiences was December 20th. My mom and dad and me moved away December 29th. So I was there in utero when this happened. Now, let me get back to the question you really asked, which I wanted to talk a little bit about, like, where have I come to on thinking about this? Provisionally, but where I am is on this. I think that this thing we're in is a theater.
Aha. Okay.
Consciousness is set up. Its narrative is what it is. Now, this mystical consciousness is something different, right? Because time is timeless. There's no story. It's noetic. So that's a different frame. But in terms of ordinary consciousness of life, what I am the person of a certain life story. Now, you see, I'm sure your mind is working. Aristotle said, remember, in his original book of fallacies, 13 of them, I think it was, one of them was about literalizing a metaphor. Right? If I say that Uncle Hefford is a fat pig, so therefore go and feed him a bucket of corn or something, I'm making a logical error, right? I'm going from a metaphor to a literal. And so some might say that, what Raymond Moody is doing, he's taking one aspect of the human experience, which is the theater, and he is projecting it out into the whole as a model of reality, and that would be a logical fallacy.
What would you say to them?
I would say that no, it happened the other way around.
Okay.
If you look at the history of the theater, what happened? Well, for centuries they had in Greece this
choir
festival.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the chorus would sing the old stories, and for reasons unknown, this one performance stepped forward and spoke his own lines to create a sensation. Right? More, right? What are the Greeks all about? You live pretty close to them. You know what it is. Competition. Right? That's what it always was. Competition. But the Olympic Games thing. And so, first thing is, let's have a contest, Aristotle says, to see who can write one of the best of these. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were the winners. So what happened was that Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides were the public intellectuals of their age. This was before Socrates and philosophy got started much in Athens. And so I just think when they let's do this more, they realize, it's like life is a kind of story, and we can create a flat place here. But also at first, they thought it was channeling.
Let me pin you a bit down on this. So when you say that maybe consciousness is fundamental and this is kind of a theater, then I have two more questions for you. One is, what is the role of love in this theater? Where is it? What is it? Is it a derivative of something, or is it fundamental? What's your thought on that? And the other question I have is, why?
Why? Okay, well, number one, and the second one, I don't know. And in one way, the first thought that comes to mind is that it's fun. I mean, I would rather kind of mystical consciousness is really nice. I've been there a couple of times. But, it's a bore after a while. I prefer narrative consciousness, right? And I'm just kind of making a joke really about the mystical consciousness is nice too, because to have that standstill, right, and to contemplate is a very important thing for me because I love knowledge, and I just love to kind of be quiet and contemplate what we know. But in terms of excitement, narrative is what it's all about. And so where I don't know where this is, except that, you know what, Elie Wiesel said something that really made sense to me. Listen to what he said. He said, God made man because God loves stories.
I love this, all of this very much. Let me challenge you with one thing, and it's not a real challenge, I love what you're saying, but let me add this maybe as like a flavor, and let me see what you say. So one thing that really hooked me into this research was the life review. It's something that we wouldn't have expected from biology, because if your brain is dying, if your system is dying, evolution wants you to find a solution to run away from the tiger or keep from drowning or whatever. The last thing you want to do is listen to or feel what your interaction with your neighbor was 10 years ago and how your neighbor felt about that. So it doesn't make sense from a survival standpoint. And plus, if nothing continues afterwards, who learns the lesson? It doesn't make sense. It's a total waste of energy. So this life review somehow gives me the feeling that there is an ethical structure to the universe. What do you think about that? And if you think about this, does it give this theater and fun idea somehow a deeper structure? What are your thoughts on that?
About 10 or 15 years ago, I started asking my university student, and I've asked this to a lot of different audiences. Like I said, let's imagine, for example, imagine that you were diagnosed with some horrific infection that required you to be isolated on a desert island all by yourself for 10 years. And they could send you out there on a cargo plane. And there was room in the cargo hold for all the food and water and medicine you would need for 10 years. Plus, there was some extra room in the cargo hold where you could have a DVD, and let's say 10,000 DVDs, movies on DVDs. And the question is, would you choose all comedies? Would you?
That's an unfair question, because I'm such a harmonic person with a difficult life that somehow my mind and heart at this moment say, yeah, of course I would just always choose comedy.
Put yourself in that, that.
Yeah, we would probably choose a good mix. We would choose a good mix.
Yeah, and then people say, no. I said, well, would you choose some tragedy? I said, sure. Well, then I asked, when you were out there on that desert island all alone, watching the tragedy, would you be crying? And of course you would. And I think the setup is something like that. I think also it brings the question in of, I remember a very dramatic event to me when I was in the 12th grade, and I don't know why I remember this exactly, but I remember reading about in my high school English literature book, reading about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I don't know if you know that.
No.
That work. Anyway, it's the story of some pilgrims going to Canterbury. This is the medieval work.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the people are going along on the pilgrimage to Canterbury. But to pass the time, they tell each other stories.
Okay.
And so what is called the framing device, or the frame narrative, is the story of the pilgrims on the way to Canada.
Okay.
But the frame narrative is the structure for telling the individual stories that each of the pilgrims tell the individual stories to entertain the other pilgrims.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Another one that you would probably be more aware of, this one would be Boccaccio.
Yeah.
In the Decameron.
Yes.
Right, and it's the same deal, right? They are in the villa outside of Milan or wherever it is, and isolated by the plague, and they tell each other stories. So the story of the house and the plague, that's the frame narrative.
Yeah.
And so the individual narrative. And so I'm wondering what the structure of the whole thing is.
Okay. I assuming, go ahead.
Assuming, that's just, is the consciousness we have presumably when we're dead or after we die, is it narrative too, or is it some other kind of consciousness that's limited? And I don't know the answer.
I really like that question. Yeah.
I'm going on inquiring, but what I mean is I'm at a plateau like there where I cannot think myself out of it.
Let me just add, though the idea of the play, of the theater play, and the narrative framing structure appeals to me very much, I somehow have this feeling that the ethical implication or the ethical depth of the life review is something that matters. I think it really, really points to something.
What comes out of that is two things primarily. People say what this is all about is love, learning to love, and the pursuit of knowledge. And then a third group of people are people who never took a paint to put a paintbrush to a canvas or never thought of music or and then they have a near-death experience and they became virtuosos or some art. I don't know if you know about Dr. Anthony Chicoria.
Of course I do. And there's a German Windner who, after his near-death experience was told to paint. And he came back and he suddenly became this amazing artist. He's not selling his paintings, so this is not a commercial thing, and it's very unexplained. So I very much know these stories. They're amazing.
Yeah, I have this sensitivity that you do too about money based, because I just, it's not that I disdain money, it's just that I cannot process it. My thought process doesn't work on money. So therefore I'm always kind of, it's always that's how it is for scholars and writers.
I know, I can relate. Well, Mr. Moody, I think, though it's so awesome to talk to you, I think we slowly have to get to an end. There's maybe one more question that I have for you. We very briefly touched on the word reincarnation earlier. Do you want to maybe say a few more words about what you think, what that could be and why it is and where is it going, and just talk a bit about it?
Well, one thing I find so interesting is that there is this opinion in the United States. I don't know about Germany, but for a long time there's opinion, this reincarnation, it came here from the East, in the 19th century. The gurus brought it over to a academic conference on religion, and that is bonked. I mean, the intellectual tradition of the United States and of the Western world came from Pythagoras. And, the inventors of Western thought were in reincarnation. Pythagoras and Plato and Empedocles. So, so where I am on it is that, number one, my wife and I are not religious. We never took our kids to churches, and also, we talked about what for dinner, let's go to the movies, and my kids found out about my book, Life After Life, by looking me up on the internet. They had no idea of all this. But also now, independently, when they were very little, started talking about their past life recollections. I'm stymied. I can't deny. And not only that, I can't deny that it was true in one case, like my son Carter. When he was 5, just out of nowhere, he started talking about he saw it. We're flashing through the TV channels, and he saw a documentary about village life in China. Dad, that's my village. Yeah, that's my village. Like, before I got to you and Mom, I was in China with my other mom and dad. Well, I know. And he could tell why it wasn't catching hold. And so then, as though to clarify me, he said, yeah. And then I was up in the tree looking down at you and Mommy lying in the grass. And I knew exactly what I was talking about, because my wife and I were in Greece, and we were at the Oracle of the Dead. And so it was out in the middle of nowhere. And so we were exhausted from the flight. So the attendant at the Oracle of the Dead could tell us that just go lie down in the grass and take a nap. And there were these big trees around. And we were talking about adopting a baby.
Oh, wow.
You know, what can I say?
Yeah. And why is it? Why would that? So if there is like a soul, something that keeps moving, what would you think? Why does it keep reincarnating? I mean, I have thoughts on that, but what are your thoughts?
I'm so impressed by what Plato said about that. He was made. I think he was just making a funny observation, but it's so true. He's talking about at the last of the Republic. He's talking about just before people come back here, right? He said they talk to the guy, the psychiatrist, or the prophet. He gives you he shows you all these different patterns of life that you could live. Right. So they insist patterns of lives. They don't say lives, these patterns of lives. And so that's the discussion. And then kind of as an aside, the guy who's showing everybody the patterns and helping them see that. But it's just amazing to me how usually they just use pretty much the same thing again.
Oh, that is so nice.
Yeah, Plato's observation was superb. I mean, you know, he was a playwright before he was
a philosopher. Well, Dr. Moody, it was such an awesome pleasure to have you. It's so good to see you healthy and laughing and so, thoughtful. It's wonderful. So thank you, first of all, so much.
Thank you. And I wish I had some way of getting my book Swan Song to you, but it's the difficulty right now is getting them printed. We have, it's like I have no knowledge of technology, so it's like we're getting the funds together to get it printed is the next step.
Well, since I'm a physicist in cosmology, I sort of believe, if you will, in the block universe, in the existence of everything that was exists as much as the now and the future. So since I'll be getting your book in the future, I in some way already have it,
Let me say, in the Timaeus of Plato, he talks about block universe. And what he says in that context, he talks about time, and he says the words are, to translate them into modern words, would be time is the movies of eternity, the moving pictures of eternity.
That is very smart, and I will look more into this because in physics that even really makes sense. Dr. Moody, such a pleasure. Please stay healthy.
Well, it's up to God. I am not a religious person in any way because I talk to God every day. Never said a word to me about religion.
Yes.
But I do have a relationship with God, and so I just, I turn that over. I do my walk every day because I'm an exercise addict and stuff like that. And I got 2 kids to take care of and a wife. So, I'm on board with that remark, but I do my best.
Super. Keep doing that. I'm so happy to have seen you. Thanks so much for this fascinating interview. Thanks for having taken the time to speak with us, and all the best to you.